In the middle of hurried days and the noise that lingers long after the sun goes down, sometimes we come across a very different kind of presence. Not loud, not trying to draw attention, not stepping forward to lead the room. And yet when someone carrying Cancer energy walks into a space, the atmosphere seems to soften, as if someone quietly opened a window and a cool breeze slipped in. Cancer is often described with one simple word: sensitive. But if you listen more closely, beneath that sensitivity, there is something far more intricate, an almost wordless awareness. They seem to hear what isn't being said, to notice the smallest shift in someone's eyes, to feel the subtle tremor in another person's heart. Not because they are analyzing every detail, but because their own heart remains open, receiving emotional currents that move quietly beneath the surface. Maybe that's why people often breathe a little easier around Cancer. Not because Cancer delivers brilliant advice, not because they solve every problem. Sometimes their presence alone is enough for someone to feel truly heard. In a room filled with tension, Cancer may not be the one speaking the most, but they're often the one holding the emotional rhythm steady. That calm doesn't come from avoiding feelings. It comes from walking through them without losing their gentleness. The influence of Cancer rarely looks like the kind of power the world celebrates. It doesn't rely on volume. It doesn't depend on forceful decisions. It's more like the tide quietly lifting the shoreline day after day. No one hears the tide the moment it begins to rise, yet every grain of sand feels the shift. That kind of influence is relational, atmospheric. It spreads naturally without needing to announce itself. In late-night conversations, Cancer often places a hand over their own heart before placing words into the air. They understand that emotions are not problems to fix, but experiences to acknowledge. When someone sits beside them, that person may feel allowed to be a little more vulnerable, allowed to admit unnamed worries, allowed to exhale the exhaustion they've been carrying for too long. And sometimes, simply being given that permission is a profound gift. Those who have lived long enough begin to realize that strength is not always about control. Sometimes strength is the ability to keep your heart soft in a world that constantly tempts you to close it. Cancer carries that kind of strength. They may not lead from the front, but they often hold the invisible thread that keeps people connected. In a family, among friends, within a community, they can be the quiet anchor, the place others return to when they need to feel understood. There are evenings when Cancer sits alone by a window and wonders if their sensitivity makes them more fragile. But in those quiet moments, they often realize something else. Because they feel deeply, they also see beauty others might overlook. They notice the smallest gestures of love, the faint glimmers of hope, the subtle signs that someone is reaching out even if they don't know how to ask. Or if you are Cancer, you may have felt that you don't need many words to be understood. You may have sensed that you don't need to prove yourself loudly to be recognized. Your presence, when it is honest and whole, already carries a unique kind of influence. And if you're listening to this on a quiet night, you might begin to smile softly, realizing that your strength was never about imposing your will. It has always been about touching hearts through steady gentleness. And as we remain here a little longer in the stillness of the night, with thoughts moving slowly between us, perhaps the story of Cancer is still unfolding, like water that never truly stops flowing, like a heartbeat, quietly echoing in its own tender darkness. Like a heartbeat, quietly echoing within its own tender darkness. And as the story continues to unfold, we begin to notice something else about Cancer, something not loud, not dramatic, yet quietly shaping the way they move through life. Emotional memory, not just remembering what was said on a distant afternoon, but remembering how that afternoon felt. The softness or sharpness of the light, the slight tremor in someone's voice, the few seconds of silence that made the heart sink just a little. Cancer seems to carry experiences the way the ocean holds the echo of every wave. Each emotion that passes through doesn't disappear entirely. It leaves behind a thin layer of sediment, adding depth to the inner landscape. They may not retell every detail, but when they face a similar moment again, there's often a quiet sense of familiarity, as if their soul has walked this road before. That memory isn't always comfortable. Some recollections tighten the chest the instant they're touched. A scent, a song, a fleeting glance, and something long asleep stirs again. Yet, through this capacity to feel and remember, Cancer slowly forms an understanding not everyone possesses. They don't just know what happened. They understand why it mattered, why it lingered, why it reached so deep. Over time, those emotional memories begin to arrange themselves into patterns. Cancer may recognize a familiar behavior in a relationship, an emotional cycle that once left them drained, a subtle sign that something is no longer aligned. They don't need complicated language to describe it. It's more of a gentle knowing, a quiet awareness that something has been learned from the past. This doesn't mean Cancer never stumbles. They can love the wrong person, trust too quickly, place their heart somewhere not ready to hold it. But even then, they rarely walk away empty-handed. Each experience becomes another piece in their inner mosaic. Instead of shutting down completely, they often turn inward, asking what they felt, what they needed, what voice inside them went unheard. Slowly, that emotional memory becomes wisdom, not the kind found in books or polished theories, but the kind shaped by long nights of reflection, by sitting alone at a window, by facing emotions that are hard to name. They learn to tell the difference between intuition and fear, between genuine longing and old habit. They come to understand that every feeling, light or heavy, carries a message. Perhaps that's why people often turn to Cancer when they need advice. Well, not because Cancer has perfect answers, but because they listen with their whole history. When someone shares a story, Cancer doesn't just hear it. They feel it through the echoes of their own past. They remember a similar ache, a similar joy, a similar uncertainty, and gently step into the other person's shoes. That empathy isn't shallow. It's nourished by layers of emotional sediment collected over years. This kind of emotional intelligence doesn't need to be displayed. It doesn't need to prove itself right or argue to win. It shows up in the way Cancer chooses silence when silence is wiser, in the way they speak when the heart insists, in the way they walk away when they recognize an old pattern repeating. It is a strength quiet but enduring, not sharp like a blade, but deep like the sea. And as we sit here together listening to the subtle movements within Cancer's inner world, we begin to see that memory isn't only something that pulls us backward. For Cancer, memory can be a gentle compass, a guide for the present moment. So when emotional tides begin to rise, they are less overwhelmed. They inhale, exhale, and allow the current to carry them forward, toward horizons still slowly opening just ahead, and letting that current carry you forward toward horizons that are still quietly unfolding ahead. And when we speak of those horizons, we can't help but touch on something else in the Cancer journey, their emotional depth. Perhaps this is the most misunderstood part of them. From the outside, someone might see a heart that moves easily, eyes that well up quickly, a spirit that responds to the smallest shift in the room. And in a world that often praises toughness, that kind of sensitivity can be mistaken for fragility. But if you sit long enough, if you listen closely enough, you begin to realize that feeling deeply is not the same as being weak. In fact, to experience the full range of life with that kind of openness requires a quiet endurance. Cancer doesn't usually run from the waves within. They can feel sadness fully, pain fully, disappointment fully. They don't deny what's happening inside just to appear strong. And what's remarkable is this. After the waves rise, after they crash, after the water settles, they continue. They may step back for a while. They may choose solitude to rearrange the world inside their chest. They may need more silence than most, but that retreat is not surrender. But it's more like the tide pulling away from shore, only to return with a new rhythm. Some Cancers have walked through wounds no one ever saw, stories left untold, dreams that once fractured, relationships that kept them awake through long nights. They may have wondered if closing their heart would hurt less, and yet in their own quiet way, they choose to keep it open. Not because they are unafraid of pain, but because they understand that closing completely also closes the door to joy. There is a kind of strength here that doesn't need applause, the strength of staying with your own emotions. When they're sad, they allow the sadness. When they need to cry, they don't treat tears as something shameful. And afterward, they slowly weave those experiences into who they are, as if every crack becomes a new line in the grain of wood, adding depth, adding character. Instead of freezing, Cancer often transforms. They reflect. They ask themselves what the moment is teaching them. They try to understand why something touched them so deeply. And through that process, they grow. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. One day, looking back, they may realize they have traveled much farther than they ever believed possible on the nights they thought they might collapse. Keeping the heart open in a world that can feel harsh is no small task. There are endless reasons to grow cynical, to armor up, to build thick walls. And yet Cancer, even when they create protection where needed, often refuses to lose that core softness. And they still believe in kindness, even after disappointment. They still hope for connection, even after being hurt. Maybe that quiet persistence is why so many see Cancer as a source of emotional strength. Not because they never fall, but because they rise in their own way. Not because they never feel exhausted, but because they allow themselves to rest and then keep walking. If you are Cancer, and you've ever blamed yourself for feeling too much, maybe it's time to look at your journey with gentler eyes. The nights you soothed yourself alone. The times you chose not to let pain turn you bitter. The moments you kept loving, even when it would have been easier to shut down. All of it speaks to a resilience that is uniquely yours. And as this story continues flowing like water through the night, we might begin to wonder what has helped Cancer preserve that softness through so many storms. What quiet light inside them still guides the way whenever their inner sea begins to sway, like a faint moon above restless waters, not overwhelming the waves, but offering just enough light to see the path ahead. Like a faint moon, just bright enough to illuminate a restless sea. And maybe that moon is the most beautiful way to describe something else within Cancer. Intuition rooted in empathy. When people hear the word intuition, they often imagine something mystical, dramatic, hard to explain. But for Cancer, intuition doesn't need to be theatrical. It moves quietly, like breath, like a heartbeat, like the subtle way they sense the smallest shift in the air. And in what seems like an ordinary conversation, Cancer may notice the slightest pause in someone's voice, an eye that looks away a second too quickly, a smile that doesn't fully reach the eyes. Details that pass unnoticed for others feel to them like a small wave brushing the shoreline, soft, but impossible to ignore. They don't always need to name what they're feeling. Sometimes it's simply a sense that something hasn't been said yet. That behind a short answer, there's a longer story. That behind calm composure, there's a heart quietly trying to stay steady. That awareness doesn't come from suspicion. It comes from sincerity, from the ability to truly place themselves in someone else's emotional space. Cancer's intuition often begins with caring. When you care deeply, you listen differently. When you listen closely, you notice subtle changes. And when you notice, you begin to understand when to move closer, when to step back, when silence is the most compassionate response, and when a gentle word might mean everything. This doesn't make Cancer flawless. They can misunderstand. They can let personal emotions blur the picture. But more often than not, that sensitivity allows them to walk through complicated emotional terrain with rare caution. They don't ignore warning signs easily. They don't dismiss unspoken needs in the people they love. In relationships, this intuition can feel like a compass. When something begins drifting off balance, Cancer often senses it before the shift becomes obvious. They may not react immediately, but inside, they're already reflecting, adjusting, asking themselves how to keep things from slipping too far. And it's that same intuition that helps them create soft but necessary boundaries. Cancer can be incredibly generous, deeply giving. But when they sense that a situation is draining them too heavily, a quiet inner voice begins to speak. Not to close the heart, but to protect it. Not to turn away from the world, but to remain whole enough to continue loving. Empathy is sometimes mistaken for weakness in a culture that glorifies cool logic. And yet, empathy may be one of the most refined forms of protection. When you understand people, you are less surprised by their behavior. When you feel the emotional current around you, you know when to slow down and when to change direction. For Cancer, intuition isn't about proving they're right. It's more like a silent companion, reminding them to pay attention to what hasn't yet been spoken aloud. And on quiet nights when they sit alone with their thoughts, they may realize that this sensitivity has protected them more than once, keeping them from unnecessary pain, guiding them closer to authentic connection. If you are Cancer, you may have wondered why you feel so much, why even the smallest shift can stay with you for hours. But maybe that sensitivity is part of how you love, part of how you guard your world. Maybe, through that deep listening, you have become a safe harbor for someone without even knowing it. And as this story continues beneath the same gentle moonlight, we're left wondering where that intuition will carry Cancer next, what waters it will guide them through, what new understandings of love, of safety, of belonging are still waiting to unfold in the quiet spaces where a heart can finally come to rest, opening new understandings of love, of safety, and of the way they build spaces where a heart can truly rest. And when we speak of rest like that, we begin to touch something deeply characteristic of Cancer energy, the ability to create emotional safety. For a long time, Cancer has been associated with home, with family, with warm dinners beneath soft yellow light. But beyond symbolism, what many people actually remember is the feeling of being in a space where they don't have to brace themselves. Cancer has a quiet way of lowering defenses, not through grand promises, not through dramatic declarations, simply through steady, sincere presence. When you're around them, you may feel you don't need to be more impressive, more successful, more put together. You're allowed to be exactly who you are, even the unfinished parts. Sometimes the space Cancer creates is literal, a small tidy room, the scent of warm tea, soft music in the background. But often it's just a conversation where you're listened to completely. They may not even realize that the way they nod, the way they pause, the way they ask one gentle question has opened a door into a place most people rarely let anyone enter. When human beings feel safe, something begins to unfold. They dare to share hidden dreams. They admit fears they once felt ashamed of. They try new things they once hesitated to attempt. In some quiet way, Cancer becomes the soft ground where those seeds can take root. They don't need to stand at the center, yet they often play a meaningful role in someone else's growth. In a family, they may be the one who keeps the rhythm steady, not through control, but through consistent care. In friendship, they may be the one who sends a message at exactly the right time. At work, they may be the colleague who makes you feel respected, understood. These actions may seem small, but repeated over time, they build a lasting sense that you are not alone. The emotional safety Cancer nurtures doesn't mean avoiding conflict. They can speak their truth. They can express disagreement. But even then, they are often mindful of the impact their words may have. They don't just ask, "Am I right?" They also ask, "How will this land on someone's heart?" In a world where many protect themselves through emotional distance, the ability to create warmth may not be recognized as power. It doesn't come with titles. It can't be measured in numbers. And yet, its influence can stretch far beyond the moment. A child raised in emotional safety may carry confidence for a lifetime. A person once deeply listened to may learn how to listen in return. Cancer may not always realize how far their impact travels. They simply act from the heart. They straighten a room, prepare a meal, keep a promise, sit beside someone in silence. And through the repetition of what seems ordinary, they weave an invisible network of support. If you are Cancer, there may have been times you felt what you do is too small to truly matter. But perhaps in someone's memory, you are the feeling of home. Perhaps your patience and quiet kindness helped someone find themselves again after losing balance. And as the night continues, as moonlight rests gently over sleeping rooftops, the story of Cancer doesn't quite end, because behind the safety they create for others, something even deeper is moving, the way they love, and how that love reaches into the deepest layers of a human soul. Because behind the safety they create for others, there is something even deeper quietly at work, the way they love, and the way that love reaches into the deepest layers of a human being. If there is one defining trait people often recognize in Cancer, it may be how they love. Not a love that burns bright and fades quickly, but a steady flame tended carefully over time. When Cancer cares about someone, that care is rarely surface level. It carries attention to small details, to subtle shifts in mood, to words left unspoken. Their love often carries a tone of protection, not control, but the simple desire to see someone safe. They may stay up a little later just to listen. They may speak a little less to give the other person room to be fully themselves. That kind of patience isn't always easy, and yet Cancer seems to accept it as a natural part of lasting connection. There are moments when they see potential in someone that the person hasn't yet learned to see. They may remind you of your strength when you begin to doubt it. They may believe in your dream, even while you hesitate. That belief isn't loud, it's steady. And over time, steady belief can become quiet fuel, helping someone take another step forward. Cancer's love isn't unconditional perfection. They have limits. They grow tired. They carry their own private sadness. But what makes their love meaningful is the willingness to go deep. They don't only love the polished parts. They love the parts still learning, still becoming. They don't stay only in bright seasons. They try to remain present through the cloudy ones too. Being loved by Cancer can feel gently nourishing. Not forced change, but encouraged growth. They don't try to control someone else's path. They quietly create conditions where that path can widen. And in that widened space, a person may slowly discover a deeper version of themselves. Over time, this kind of love can be transformative. Not because it performs instant miracles, but because it is patient. Patient in repeating kindness, patient in believing in healing, patient in holding connection when challenges appear. The transformation often happens slowly, almost invisibly. Day by day, nothing seems dramatic. But one day looking back, a person may realize they are not who they used to be. Cancer may not seek power the way the world defines it. They may not want the spotlight. They may not crave the highest stage. But emotional power moves differently. It sustains. It stabilizes. It nurtures growth over long stretches of time. It's like the unseen foundation beneath a strong home, rarely noticed, always essential. Maybe that's why so many experience Cancer as one of the Zodiac's most emotionally powerful signs. Not because they dominate, but because they maintain. Not because they conquer, but because they preserve. Not because they control, but because they care for what is most fundamental. And as the night grows later, as the sounds around us begin to quiet, we might ask ourselves, who has offered us that kind of gentleness? Or when we have offered it to someone else? Maybe in this still moment, each of us can find a little Cancer energy within. A small instinct to protect, a quiet desire to nurture, a depth of love that doesn't need to announce itself. The story softens to a close, but the feeling lingers, like the moon hanging silently in the sky, reminding us that the quietest strengths are often the ones holding an entire inner world together.